The market buzzed with life, a chaos of colors, smells, and sounds that spilled out onto every corner of the square. Traders of all species barked out promises of rare spices, potent elixirs, and glittering trinkets plucked from the farthest reaches of the galaxy. To Gideon, the cacophony was little more than a distant hum. His mind was adrift, half locked in memories, half wandering the present. There was a peculiar kind of solace in crowds, a strange comfort that came from moving unseen among others. After so many years of combat and commands, of orders and obedience, Gideon now found himself only an observer, a drifting relic from an era most here hadn't even lived to remember. His worn boots scuffed the dusty ground, carrying him past stalls overflowing with alien artifacts, strange fruits, and bottles of swirling liquid that claimed to heal or enhance. His hand brushed the small stone pendant that hung from his neck, a smooth, weighty thing that had been his only constant companion across countless battlefields. He kept it tucked under his coat, close to his chest, a quiet reassurance that he wasn't completely alone. But today, something stopped him in his tracks. His gaze, half distracted and weary, fell upon a sight that seemed to pull him back into sharp focus. Amid the laughter, the bartering, and the chatter, he noticed a figure huddled in the shadows between two towering traders. She was small, almost fragile-looking, and bound by thick, rusted chains that looped around her wrists and ankles. Her skin was a soft purple, an unusual shade that caught the light and shimmered, and her frame was slender, almost ethereal. She kept her head bowed, strands of silver hair hiding her face. But even from where he stood, Gideon could feel the weight of her fear, a palpable, trembling thing that seemed to hang around her like a shadow. Her captor, a stout and leering creature with yellowed tusks and a thick hide mottled with patches of dull green, tugged roughly on her chains, his laughter grating and rough. He spat out something in a harsh dialect Gideon couldn't fully decipher, but the mocking tone was unmistakable. Gideon's chest tightened. Something in him stirred, an old instinct he thought had long since gone quiet. He took a step closer, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. As he did, the girl lifted her head ever so slightly, her eyes catching his. They were a deep, piercing blue, brimming with a terror that Gideon recognized all too well. He had seen that same look in the eyes of countless soldiers, men and women, who had been trapped, held against their will, waiting for a savior who might never come. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two strangers in a crowded market. But in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding of helplessness, of pain buried and silent. Gideon could almost feel her fear vibrating in the space between them, and he knew, without fully understanding why, that he couldn't just walk away. Without a word, he approached the captor, his weathered face impassive but his eyes steady. The creature narrowed its gaze, eyeing him suspiciously. "What's your business?" Old man, it sneered, tightening its grip on the chain as if to shield its prize from prying eyes. "Looking for something young and malleable." Gideon ignored the insinuation, his voice as cold and calm as steel. "I want the girl." The creature's sneer grew wider, its amusement evident. "Oh? This one's not for the faint-hearted, I assure you. Damaged goods, this one, hard to control, costly too." "Name your price," Gideon said, his tone unyielding. The captor rattled off a sum that would make most buyers scoff, but Gideon didn't flinch. He reached into his coat, producing a small pouch of credits, more than he had spent in the last several months. To him, money had lost its meaning long ago. What use was currency to a man with nothing left to lose? The creature's eyes gleamed with greed as it snatched the credits from Gideon's hand. It shoved the chains toward him with a casual indifference, as though passing off a piece of junk rather than a living being. "Good luck with this one," it snickered. "You'll need it." Gideon took the chains, his hands surprisingly steady, though his heart pounded with a strange, unfamiliar urgency. He glanced down at the girl, who had retreated slightly, her body curling in on itself, as if to shield her from an expected blow. She looked up at him again, her eyes wary, her entire body tensed for some inevitable cruelty. But Gideon simply knelt down, lowering himself to her level. He spoke in a voice so soft that only she could hear. "You don't need to be afraid. I mean you no harm." She flinched, her eyes darting over his face, searching for some hidden malice, some trace of cruelty that she assumed was lurking beneath his words. He could see her struggling to believe him, to reconcile his kind voice with the harsh reality she had endured. Slowly, carefully, Gideon reached out and gently unlocked the chains, letting them fall to the ground with a soft clink. She recoiled, as if expecting punishment for her freedom, but Gideon kept his hands steady and calm, moving with a patience that surprised even him. He extended a hand toward her, his expression open, offering her not commands but a choice. "Come with me," he said quietly. "You're safe now." For a tense moment, she hesitated, her gaze flicking from his hand to his face, back and forth, as though trying to solve some impossible puzzle. Finally, with the faintest tremor, she placed her slender hand in his, her skin cool and smooth against his calloused palm. It was a tentative acceptance, a fragile sliver of trust that Gideon held as carefully as if it were made of glass. The market seemed to close in around them as he led her away, his shoulders set and his grip firm yet gentle. He felt the weight of curious stares, of whispered judgments, but he ignored them all. He was no stranger to the gaze of others, to the assumptions and judgments that came with his choices. And today his choice was this: to give this girl, this lost and broken soul, a chance at something different, something better. They walked in silence through the winding streets, the girl's steps hesitant and uncertain. Gideon moved slowly, allowing her time to adjust, to trust that he wasn't leading her toward more pain, more chains. Every so often he glanced down to see her staring at him with a look of cautious bewilderment, as though unable to believe her current reality. Finally, they reached his small, unassuming cabin on the edge of the market district. It was a simple place, a solitary dwelling that bore the quiet dignity of a life lived alone. Gideon pushed open the door and gestured for her to step inside. She hesitated at the threshold, as though fearing some trap lay waiting for her beyond the doorway. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. "There's nothing here that can hurt you." She crossed the threshold with the slow, deliberate caution of a creature stepping into unknown territory, her every movement steeped in suspicion. Gideon watched as she took in the surroundings, the worn but clean furniture, the sparse decorations, the small table set for one. There was a quiet warmth to the place, a sense of peace that he had carved out for himself in this lonely corner of the world. Gideon led her to a small room off the main living area, where a simple bed stood against the wall, draped with a faded quilt that he had once used himself. "This is for you," he said softly. "It's not much, but it's yours. No one will disturb you here." She stared at the bed, then back at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. He could see the flicker of fear, the lingering doubt that this was some elaborate trick, some game he was playing at her expense. But Gideon only offered her a small, reassuring nod before turning away, giving her the space she so clearly needed. "I'll be right outside if you need anything," he said. "Rest now." As he left her to settle, Gideon's heart ached with a strange mix of protectiveness and sorrow. He couldn't change her past, couldn't erase the shadows that haunted her. But he could, perhaps, offer her a quiet corner in this noisy galaxy, a place where she could begin to mend if she ever chose to. Outside, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the market's noise recede into the background. He had no idea what lay ahead or whether he would ever truly earn her trust. But for now, that didn't matter. For now, he would give her space, warmth, and time, things he himself had been denied so often in his own life. In the stillness of the night, under the distant hum of the stars, Gideon sat quietly, his thoughts heavy yet strangely light. And somewhere within the walls of his cabin, a frightened girl began to learn, for the first time in a long while, what it felt like to be safe. The first morning sunlight crept softly through the worn curtains of Gideon's cabin, casting a gentle glow over the room where the girl lay asleep. She was curled up tightly, almost as if shielding herself from unseen dangers, even in slumber. Gideon watched her from the doorway, careful not to intrude, but keenly aware of her presence. He had slept only lightly, his soldier's instincts always lingering, but his thoughts were consumed not by old battles or forgotten wars. This time, he found himself wondering if the girl could truly come to see his cabin as something other than another cage. As he quietly moved around the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast, he thought about how best to approach her. He knew well enough that trauma could fester and deepen when prodded too quickly or with too much force. Patience was a weapon he had honed over decades, but this was different, softer, more delicate. As the aroma of brewed tea and fresh bread filled the small cabin, he hoped it might coax her from the shadows. He set out a tray with care, a small bowl of fresh fruit, a slice of bread, some tea, and water. Food that wouldn't overwhelm or intimidate but might feel like a gentle offering, something small to ease her guard. The girl awoke as quietly as she had fallen asleep, her movements slow and deliberate, as if fearing that any sudden motion might awaken something dreadful. She sat up, blinking in the soft morning light, taking in the strange surroundings once more. For a brief moment, Gideon saw her relax, but as her gaze caught him in the doorway, the tension in her small frame returned. She froze, eyes wide, shoulders hunched defensively. He saw her gaze flick between him and the door, calculating an escape. He could almost feel the fear radiating off her like waves. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice a low murmur, like a calming breeze. "I thought you might be hungry." He gestured to the tray of food on the small table beside her bed, careful not to make any sudden movements. He didn't step forward. He wanted her to feel that the choice to approach or withdraw was entirely hers. For a long moment she simply stared at the food, her expression torn between hunger and mistrust. Gideon watched the silent struggle unfold within her. She wanted to eat, he could see that much, but years of captivity, of brutality and degradation, had taught her that gifts from strangers often came with hidden costs. Finally, tentatively, she reached for the bread, taking it into her hands as if expecting it to vanish the moment she touched it. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence, but the fact that she was eating was a small victory in itself. Gideon turned away to give her privacy, focusing instead on tidying the small kitchen, his movements unhurried. When he heard the faint clink of her cup being set back on the table, he turned to see her watching him, her blue eyes narrowed with suspicion. It was the first time she'd looked directly at him for more than a fleeting second, and he held her gaze with a steady, gentle patience. "Do you have a name?" he asked softly, hoping to open a door however small. Her face remained expressionless, her mouth a tight line, and for a moment he thought she might retreat into silence. But then, almost inaudibly, she whispered, "Aya." It was a sound as delicate as breath, as fragile as a whisper of wind. Gideon nodded, his expression calm and neutral, as though she had simply told him the time of day. Inside, though, he felt something stir, a tiny glimmer of trust. He had a name to call her now, something real, something hers. "Aya," he repeated gently, as if tasting the name. "It's good to meet you." Her eyes flickered with a hint of confusion, perhaps a touch of disbelief, but she didn't look away. Gideon felt the weight of her gaze, saw the question swimming beneath its surface. Why would he buy her only to treat her with such care? What was the purpose of this quiet kindness? After a moment he reached for the pendant around his neck, pulling it free so it hung in the light. It was small and unremarkable to most, a simple stone worn smooth by years of handling, etched with faint, almost forgotten symbols. To Gideon, it was a reminder of survival, of the will to keep going even when the path ahead seemed dark. "This stone has been with me a long time," he told her, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble. "I used to keep it as a reminder that even in the worst of times, there's a way through." He placed it on the table, sliding it toward her with a careful, deliberate gesture. "I want you to have it." Aya's eyes widened slightly, her gaze flicking between him and the stone, as though she were certain there had to be some hidden meaning behind his words. For a moment she reached out but quickly pulled her hand back, suspicion tightening her brow. Gideon didn't push. Instead he stood and took a step back, allowing her space to examine the gift if she chose to. "Take it if you want to," he said, his voice soft, "or leave it. Either way, it's yours now." Aya's hand hovered uncertainly over the pendant. Slowly, inch by inch, she closed her fingers around it, holding it in her palm with a kind of reverent disbelief. Gideon saw the way her fingers trembled, the faintest quiver that betrayed her nerves, and he realized just how little kindness she must have known. The day passed in quiet exchanges. She continued to eat sparingly, more as if testing whether it was safe than from actual hunger. Gideon let her explore her space without interruption, watching as she moved cautiously around the room, fingers brushing over objects with a kind of detached curiosity. She touched the window's frame, the edge of the quilt, the soft wood of the small table beside her bed, as if each texture held some secret. As evening approached, he brought her a simple set of clothes, clean and soft, but she hesitated, eyeing them with deep mistrust. "I thought you might be more comfortable in these," he offered, setting them down on the chair beside her. He avoided eye contact, sensing that she preferred not to be watched. "If you need anything, I'll be right outside." "This is your space now, Aya. You can come and go as you wish." He could feel her confusion from across the room, a pulse of bewilderment that seemed to linger between them. She held the clothes, fingers trailing over the fabric as though it might turn to dust in her hands. And then, without a word, she slipped into the shadows, retreating to the small adjoining washroom. Gideon moved to the main room, sitting at the table with a well-worn book, though he barely registered the words on the page. He could hear the faint sounds of water running, and he imagined her standing there, vulnerable and uncertain, shedding the remnants of her captivity one cautious layer at a time. When she finally emerged, the change was almost startling. She looked smaller, yet somehow more herself, free from the grimy remnants of her past life. Her purple skin seemed to catch the soft glow of the lamps, casting a faint lavender shadow on the walls. Her hair, damp and shining, framed her face, and for the first time he saw her as something more than a terrified captive. She was a girl, young and fragile, yes, but with a glimmer of resilience beneath the layers of fear. He offered her a small, tentative smile, hoping to communicate that she was safe here, that she could find some small comfort in this unfamiliar sanctuary. But Aya only gave him a fleeting glance, her eyes still holding that wary distance, as if she were waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the facade of kindness to crumble. The evening stretched on in silence, broken only by the occasional clink of dishes or the creak of the wooden floor beneath their feet. Gideon let her be, understanding that words would do little to dissolve years of mistrust. He busied himself with mundane tasks, anything to give her the space she needed. As he prepared for bed, he noticed her standing by the window, staring out at the distant stars. She stood with her shoulders tense, her arms wrapped around herself. Yet there was a quiet wonder in her expression, a fleeting glimpse of the child she might have once been. Gideon watched her for a moment, a strange sense of protectiveness filling him. He didn't want to intrude, didn't want to shatter that fragile peace. "Good night, Aya," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that he hoped might reach her. She didn't respond, didn't turn to acknowledge him, but he saw her fingers clutch the pendant he had given her, holding it close to her chest, as though it were a lifeline. And for now, that was enough. In the quiet solitude of the cabin, under the watchful gaze of the distant stars, Gideon slipped into a light sleep, knowing that, somewhere in the next room, Aya held onto that small piece of hope. It was a silent sanctuary they had begun to build, piece by piece, a place where she could, perhaps, begin to trust again. The days blended together in a rhythm that was both steady and strange, like the slow turn of a forgotten clock. Gideon and Aya began to settle into an unspoken routine, each morning starting with her quiet footsteps as she emerged from her room, alert and careful, still keeping a small but deliberate distance from him. Her every movement was edged with a deep-rooted caution, a wariness that Gideon understood all too well. He rarely spoke beyond the necessities, sensing that words would do little to bridge the gap between them. Instead, he focused on creating a predictable world for her, a place where she might find a sliver of safety and routine. Every morning, he prepared a simple breakfast, leaving it out for her without making a show of watching her eat. She would approach cautiously, her gaze flickering toward him in brief, hesitant glances, and she would eat in small, careful bites, as if each mouthful was still suspect. Sometimes he caught her watching him, her blue eyes sharp and searching, as though trying to decode him from afar. Gideon could only imagine the questions swirling within her, questions about his motives, about why he had bought her freedom and yet kept her here, why he continued to show her kindness despite her persistent silence and distrust. The days passed in this fragile routine, marked by small, subtle changes. She began to leave her door open just a crack, as if testing the boundaries of her freedom, a quiet signal that she no longer felt the need to seal herself away entirely. It was a small thing, but to Gideon it was as if the sun had broken through a long, shrouded sky. One afternoon, as Gideon sat mending an old cloak by the fire, he glanced up to find her watching him, her gaze more open, more curious than he had seen before. She stood at the edge of the room, her slender frame outlined in the warm light of the fire, and for a moment she seemed almost hesitant, as if debating whether to retreat or approach. "You're welcome to sit," he offered, his voice gentle, casual, as if they were simply two old friends passing time. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she stepped forward, lowering herself onto a small stool by the fire. She folded her arms around her knees, drawing them close to her chest, still maintaining a safe distance. He continued his mending, not wanting to break the fragile quiet that had settled between them. It was enough that she was there, sharing the same space without fear, without the trembling distrust that had haunted her every movement. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, the only sound being the soft crackling of the fire. But then, without warning, she spoke, her voice a whisper so faint it barely stirred the air. "Why did you buy me?" Gideon paused, his needle hovering over the cloth, and looked up to find her staring at him, her expression unreadable, a mix of confusion and guarded hope. He set down his work and leaned back, considering his words carefully. "I saw you there," he said, his voice low, steady. "And I saw someone who didn't deserve to be in chains. Someone who deserved more." He hesitated, unsure how to explain a decision he hadn't fully understood himself. "I don't have all the answers, Aya. I only knew that I couldn't leave you there." She looked down, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on her knee. The firelight flickered over her face, illuminating the faint traces of scars on her wrists, a map of her past suffering etched into her skin. "People don't usually do things like that," she murmured, her tone laced with bitterness, as though kindness was an alien concept to her, something she could only imagine as a distant, unreachable idea. Gideon nodded, his face softening. "No, they don't. But sometimes you find people who do. Not because they're good or noble, but because they've seen too much suffering to let it continue." She fell silent, absorbing his words, her expression thoughtful but wary. There was a question in her eyes, a doubt that lingered unspoken. "Do you have family?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The question surprised him, catching him off guard. For a moment, a shadow passed over his face, memories surfacing that he had buried long ago. "I did," he replied slowly. "A long time ago. But war has a way of taking things from you." His gaze drifted to the pendant she wore around her neck, the one he had given her. "I lost many people. And I lost parts of myself, too." Aya looked away, the faintest flicker of understanding passing over her features. In that moment, Gideon realized she knew that feeling of having lost something that could never be restored, of carrying scars that went deeper than skin. Their conversation faded, replaced once again by the gentle crackling of the fire. Gideon returned to his mending, his hands moving in slow, practiced motions, and for a while they simply existed in shared silence. Days passed, and Gideon began to notice more small changes. She started to join him for meals, no longer hovering at the edge of the room but sitting across from him, her movements still cautious but less guarded. Sometimes she would ask him questions, tentative inquiries about the galaxy, about the strange foods he prepared, about the places he had been. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she asked him about the pendant again, her fingers brushing over the smooth surface. "You said this was for protection," she said, her tone curious but hesitant, as though fearing she might be prying too deeply. He nodded, watching her with a soft, almost paternal affection. "Yes, I carried it through many battles. It was a reminder that even in the darkest places, there's always a reason to keep going." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. Her eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, he saw a glimmer of something like gratitude. She held the pendant to her chest, her fingers wrapped around it tightly, as if drawing strength from it. "I never had anything like that," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I never had anything to hold on to." Gideon felt a pang in his chest, a deep ache that he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to reach out, to place a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but he knew it would only make her retreat. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze warm and understanding. "You have it now," he said gently. "And it's yours to keep, a reminder that you don't have to face things alone anymore." Aya's face softened, and for a moment he thought he saw a tear glisten in her eye, though she quickly looked away, hiding her face in the shadows. She took a deep, steadying breath, and when she looked back at him, her expression was composed once more, her walls firmly back in place. One afternoon, after several weeks of this slow, silent dance, Gideon sensed that she was ready for something more. He invited her to help him with some simple tasks around the cabin, chopping vegetables for supper, folding freshly washed linens, tending to the small garden he kept outside. At first she was hesitant, her every movement careful, as if expecting some hidden punishment for doing something wrong. But as the days went on, she began to find a strange comfort in these small acts, her hands steadying, her touch growing more assured. One evening, as they worked side by side in the kitchen, She surprised him by speaking without prompting, her voice quiet but confident. "My old master," she began, her tone thick with a bitterness that she couldn't quite hide. "He never let me eat without permission. He used to," she trailed off, her face tightening, her hands clenching at her sides. "Sometimes he wouldn't feed me for days. He'd watch me, waiting for me to beg." Gideon's chest tightened, a surge of anger flickering through him, but he kept his face calm, his voice gentle. "You don't have to worry about that here," he said, his tone reassuring. "You don't have to beg for anything." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to find a crack in his kindness, a flaw that would reveal his true intentions. But he held her gaze steadily, offering her the warmth of his sincerity. Slowly she nodded, and he saw the faintest hint of relief in her expression. She relaxed her hands, letting out a long breath, as if she had been holding it for far too long. For the first time Gideon saw her smile. It was a small, fragile thing, barely more than a faint curve of her lips, but it was there, a glimpse of something unguarded, something real. And in that moment he felt a warmth bloom in his chest, a sense of quiet triumph that filled the empty corners of his heart. Over time, Aya began to share more small details of her life, each story another piece of the shattered puzzle she carried within her. She told him about the other slaves, about the punishments, about the silence and fear that had filled her days. She spoke in fragments, her voice barely a whisper, as though she feared that speaking her past would somehow make it real again. Gideon listened with the patience of a man who had seen too much, his expression a steady, calming presence. He knew better than to offer empty platitudes. He simply let her words flow, holding them with the same care he would hold a wounded creature. And in return he told her about his own past, the battles, the comrades he had lost, the ache of loneliness that had settled into his bones after so many years on the front lines. Their shared stories became a quiet sanctuary, a place where they could both find solace in each other's pain. And as the days passed, Gideon noticed that Aya's walls began to lower, her distrust beginning to dissolve in the warmth of their companionship. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he noticed that she was no longer clutching the pendant as if it were a lifeline. Instead, she wore it comfortably around her neck, letting it rest against her chest, as though she had finally accepted it as her own. For Gideon, it was a small but profound victory, a sign that their silent sanctuary was growing stronger with each passing day. And as they sat together side by side, he realized that this cabin, once a place of solitude and silence, had become something more, a home, built from fragments of trust, shared stories, and the slow, steady healing of two wounded souls, finding solace in each other's presence. In the days that followed, Aya's demeanor began to change. She moved with a lighter step, her posture less guarded, her eyes more open. She began to venture outside, exploring the forest around the cabin, her fingers brushing over the bark of trees, her gaze filled with a quiet wonder as she took in the natural beauty around her. Gideon often joined her on these walks, keeping a respectful distance, letting her set the pace. One afternoon, as they strolled through a sun-dappled grove, Aya paused, her gaze fixed on a small cluster of wildflowers growing near the base of a tree. She knelt down, her fingers brushing over the delicate petals, her expression filled with a gentle curiosity that Gideon had rarely seen before. "They're beautiful," she murmured, her voice soft, almost reverent. Gideon nodded, watching her with a quiet smile. "They are, and resilient too. They grow here every year, despite the harsh winters, the storms. They always come back, no matter what." Aya looked up at him, her eyes thoughtful, as if the flowers had sparked something within her. She reached out, plucking a single bloom, cradling it carefully in her hands as though it were something precious. Maybe I can be like that too," she whispered, her voice filled with a tentative hope, a fragile belief that was slowly taking root within her. Gideon felt a swell of pride and affection, a warmth that filled him as he watched her hold that small flower, her expression soft and filled with a quiet strength. "You already are, Aya," he replied gently. "You've been through so much, but you're still here, still growing, still finding beauty, even in the smallest things. That's a kind of strength that not many people have." She looked at him, a small smile curving her lips, and for the first time he saw not just a frightened, wounded girl, but a young woman filled with a quiet resilience, a strength that had survived despite everything she had endured. As the days turned into weeks, Aya continued to heal, her spirit blossoming like the wildflowers she had come to love. She laughed more freely, asked more questions, and shared more stories, each one a small piece of her past that she was slowly letting go. And Gideon, in turn, felt a new sense of purpose growing within him. For years he had wandered through life like a ghost, carrying the weight of old battles, old scars. But now, with Aya by his side, he felt as though he, too, was beginning to heal. Her laughter, her resilience, her trust, they had become a balm for his own wounds, a light that guided him out of the shadows he had lived in for so long. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he noticed that she no longer clutched the pendant he had given her as if it were a lifeline. Instead, she wore it comfortably, letting it rest against her chest like a piece of herself that she had finally accepted. "Thank you, Gideon," she said quietly, her voice filled with a warmth that he had never heard before. "For everything. For giving me a chance to find myself again." He looked at her, his eyes soft, filled with a quiet pride. "It's been an honor, Aya," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Watching you grow, watching you find your strength, it's been the greatest gift I could have asked for." She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that filled the room with warmth, and in that moment, Gideon felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. They had both found something precious here in this small cabin, a sanctuary, a place of healing and trust. And as they sat together, the shadows of their pasts finally fading into the quiet light of the fire, Gideon knew that they had become more than just companions. They had become family, bound by a trust and love that went beyond words, beyond fear, beyond pain. They had found in each other the sanctuary they had both been searching for. The air had a crispness that hinted at winter's approach, but the late autumn sunlight still lingered, casting a soft, golden glow across the forest that surrounded Gideon's cabin. Aya and Gideon walked side by side along a narrow trail, each lost in thought. The forest felt alive with the crunch of fallen leaves beneath their feet, the sharp, earthy scent of pine, and the occasional call of a bird flitting between the trees. They had grown used to these walks together, finding a quiet solace in the rhythm of their steps and the gentle murmur of nature around them. Yet today, Gideon felt a weight on his chest, a heaviness that had grown over the past few weeks, pressing down on him each time he looked at Aya. She was no longer the frightened girl he had rescued from chains and despair. She had bloomed into something bright and beautiful, her spirit resilient, her laughter like music that filled the spaces once hollowed by years of solitude and loss. She moved with a grace that was entirely her own, her presence a light that had brought warmth and meaning back into his life. But with that new light came a dilemma, an inner conflict that Gideon had wrestled with in silence. As Aya grew stronger, more confident, and more vibrant, Gideon felt his heart soften in a way he hadn't expected. The affection he had developed for her had deepened, blossoming into something more powerful than he had been prepared to face. He knew the feeling was there, deep and undeniable, and he feared what it would mean for both of them. As they reached a small clearing by a quiet stream, Aya stopped, crouching down to gather a handful of smooth stones. She smiled as she examined them, her gaze filled with the simple joy that came from her newfound freedom. Gideon's heart ached at the sight, a bittersweet ache that filled him with both longing and regret. He knew he had to tell her he owed her the truth, even if it risked shattering the bond they had built. "Aya," he said, his voice low and steady as he broke the silence. She looked up, her eyes warm and open, a question in her gaze. "There's something I need to tell you." Aya straightened, a hint of curiosity lighting her expression. She gave him her full attention, her face soft with the trust and affection that had grown between them. "What is it, Gideon?" she asked, her tone gentle. Gideon took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he struggled to find the right words. "These past months, they've meant a lot to me," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "You've brought life back into this old heart of mine, in ways I didn't think were possible." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant trees, unable to meet her eyes. "But I'm afraid I've developed feelings for you that I have no right to feel." Aya's expression softened, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding, but she didn't interrupt him. Gideon forced himself to continue, knowing he had to say it all. "You're young, Aya, and you have your whole life ahead of you," he said, his voice wavering with the weight of his confession. "You deserve someone who can give you a future, someone closer to your age, someone who can match the brightness of your spirit." He swallowed, his throat tight. I'm an old man, Aya. You deserve so much more than what I can offer you." Aya listened in silence, her gaze unwavering, her expression unreadable. When he finally fell silent, she stepped closer, reaching out to place a gentle hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, grounding, and he felt his heart stir, a glimmer of hope mixed with the fear of rejection. "Gideon," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet strength that surprised him. "I've heard your words, but there's something you need to understand." She looked at him, her eyes clear and steady, filled with a determination that he hadn't expected. "Age doesn't matter to me, not when it comes to love." He stared at her, his heart pounding as he struggled to process her words. "Aya, it's not just the age difference. I've seen too much darkness, lived through too much. I'm a broken man, and you're—" "I'm someone who understands brokenness," she interrupted gently, her gaze unwavering. "You think you're the only one with scars, Gideon? I have them too. They may not be visible, but they're there, buried deep inside." She took a deep breath, her hand tightening slightly on his arm. "I know what it's like to carry pain, to live with the shadows of the past. But with you, those shadows don't feel as heavy. With you I feel safe and loved." He looked away, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "But Aya, I can't be the man you deserve. I can't offer you the life that someone younger, someone unburdened, could give you." Aya's expression softened, a tender smile gracing her lips. "Do you know why I fell in love with you, Gideon?" she asked, her voice as soft as a whisper. He turned back to her, his gaze filled with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. "Why?" "Because you see me," she replied simply. "You see me as I am with all my pain and scars, and you accept me. You don't pity me, you don't look down on me. You treat me like I'm whole, like I'm worthy. You make me feel loved, Gideon, in a way that no one else ever has." She stepped closer, her hand reaching up to rest gently on his cheek, her fingers warm against his skin. He closed his eyes, feeling the tenderness of her touch, the softness of her presence. He felt the years melt away, felt himself surrender to the love that had grown between them. "Aya," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of longing and hesitation. "I'm afraid of failing you. I'm afraid that one day you'll look back and regret this choice, that you'll wish for someone younger, someone who could offer you a future I can't give." She shook her head, her gaze filled with a quiet, fierce determination. "I choose you, Gideon, not because you're perfect, but because you're you, because you're kind and patient and strong. Because you've given me a home, a family, and a love that I never thought I could have." Her fingers brushed over his cheek, a tender, reassuring touch. "And because I love you." Her words wrapped around him, filling the empty spaces in his heart that he had thought would remain hollow forever. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze, and in that moment he saw the depth of her love, the strength of her choice. She wasn't choosing him out of gratitude or pity or loneliness. She was choosing him because she truly loved him, because she saw him, just as he saw her. Slowly, Gideon lifted a hand to cover hers, his touch gentle but filled with a quiet resolve. "Aya," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent my life in shadows, believing that love was something I could never have, something I didn't deserve." He took a shaky breath, his thumb brushing over her hand. "But you've given me a reason to believe that maybe I do deserve it, that maybe even after all the darkness there's still light for me." She smiled, her eyes filled with tears of joy and relief, and she stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him in a gentle embrace. He held her, his arms a steady, grounding presence around her, his heart filled with a love that felt both terrifying and beautiful. As they returned to the warmth of the cabin, Aya held Gideon's hand a little tighter, her eyes filled with a newfound certainty. She stopped him just inside the door, her gaze meeting his, searching his face as if memorizing every line, every expression. There was a quiet vulnerability in her eyes, mingling with a strength he knew had grown from years of hardship. And yet, tonight, as they stood in the soft light, all he saw was the openness of her love for him, pure and unwavering. Gideon's hand rose to brush a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering for a moment against her skin. The warmth of her touch, the softness of her gaze pulled at his heart, and he felt himself surrender to the deep trust that had grown between them. He leaned in slowly, letting her see every flicker of emotion in his eyes, giving her the space to pull away if she chose. But she didn't. Instead, Aya lifted her face to his, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. She met his kiss with a tender passion, a quiet, heartfelt affirmation of everything she had told him by the stream. Her fingers traced over his jaw, her touch gentle, reverent, as though she were afraid he might disappear if she held him too tightly. And Gideon's heart swelled with the realization that she was here, in his arms, out of choice and love, that she had looked beyond his years, his scars, his past, and had chosen him fully, without hesitation. They moved together slowly, savoring each touch, each heartbeat, as if they had all the time in the world. Their embrace was filled with unspoken promises, with the trust they had spent months building, and with a love that transcended words. They held each other close, the warmth of their shared affection weaving between them, filling the empty spaces each had carried alone for so long. In the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the familiar glow of the firelight, Gideon and Aya found solace in one another, their hearts and souls intertwined in a way that went beyond the physical. They were two souls who had traveled through darkness, finding light in each other's arms, and tonight, they embraced that light fully, with gratitude and love. As the night wore on, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, a quiet peace settling over them. They spoke in whispers, shared gentle laughter, and allowed themselves to bask in the safety they had created together. And in that moment, Gideon knew that he had found more than just love. He had found a partner, a friend, and a home in Aya. They drifted to sleep, their hearts beating in perfect harmony, each knowing that this, at last, was the beginning of a life they would share together, with all the joy, trust, and love they had fought so hard to find. Winter arrived with a quiet intensity, blanketing the forest in a soft, shimmering layer of snow that transformed the landscape into something out of a dream. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with white, and the air carried a clean, crisp chill that seemed to heighten every sound, every breath. Gideon's cabin, tucked away in this secluded world, became an island of warmth and light amidst the cold, a sanctuary where Aya and Gideon settled into a life of shared purpose, companionship, and now love. Inside, the hearth crackled with a steady, comforting warmth, filling the cabin with the scent of burning wood and the soft glow of embers. Aya stood by the window, wrapped in a thick, hand-woven blanket, her eyes tracing the falling snowflakes outside. Her gaze was contemplative, thoughtful, and Gideon could sense there was something stirring within her, something just below the surface, like a question or a yearning she was still too shy to voice. He walked over, his footsteps quiet, and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. She leaned into him, her body relaxing against his, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the world outside transform under the weight of the season. "What are you thinking about, Aya?" he asked softly, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the stillness. She looked up at him, her eyes bright and filled with a warmth that never failed to take his breath away. "I was thinking about the future," she admitted, her voice a soft whisper. "About what we might do, where we might go." She hesitated, searching his face for understanding. "Do you think we'll stay here forever?" Gideon smiled, a gentle curve of his lips as he looked down at her. "I never thought about leaving," he confessed. "This place has been my sanctuary, my escape from the world. And now, with you here, it's felt like a real home for the first time." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "But if you wish to see more of the galaxy, I would go anywhere with you, Aya. You've given me a reason to live beyond these walls." Her smile grew bright and genuine, and she took his hand in hers, her fingers threading through his, as though she were drawing strength from him. "I've never seen the world," she said, her voice tinged with wonder. "Not outside of the cages and cells I was kept in. Sometimes, I dream about it, about seeing the stars up close, about walking in places that aren't filled with fear." Gideon felt a pang in his chest, a familiar ache of both sorrow and protectiveness. He knew that she had seen only the darkest parts of life, had been exposed to cruelty and captivity when she should have known freedom and joy. And he wanted, more than anything, to be the one who could show her a world that was beautiful, a life that was free. "Then let's go," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "Let's see those stars up close. Let's walk in every corner of this galaxy together." Her eyes sparkled with excitement, but then a shadow of hesitation crossed her face. "But what if it's dangerous? What if we're not safe out there? I don't want to lose." This she looked around the cabin, at the warmth they had built, the home they had made together. He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing over her cheek in a tender, reassuring touch. "Home is here, Aya," he murmured. "It's with you. No matter where we go, as long as we're together, we'll have this." She smiled, the worry easing from her expression, and she leaned into his touch, her eyes filled with trust. "Then let's make this our future, Gideon. Let's see the world. And let's live for ourselves." The decision sparked something within both of them, a flame of excitement, of possibility. Over the next few days, they began to plan, gathering supplies, sorting through the few belongings they would need for their journey. The cabin, once filled with solitude, now echoed with the sound of laughter, of shared dreams, of two people building a life together with intention and joy. But as the days passed, Gideon noticed that Aya often grew quiet in the evenings, her gaze turning inward, her expression distant. One night, as they sat by the fire, he reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and steady. "Aya, if there's anything weighing on you, you know you can tell me," he said gently, his voice filled with concern. "Whatever it is, I want to be here for you." She looked at him, her face softening, and for a moment he saw a vulnerability there that both pained and humbled him. She took a shaky breath, her hand squeezing his. I was thinking about my family," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "About the people I lost, the life I was supposed to have before it was taken from me." She looked down, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and longing. "Sometimes I wonder if they're out there somewhere. If they survived." Gideon's heart tightened, a surge of empathy flooding through him. He knew what it was to carry the weight of lost family, to wonder if the people you loved were still out there, waiting or searching for you. He reached out, pulling her close, his arms a protective circle around her. "If they are out there, we'll find them," he murmured, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "We'll search every corner of this galaxy if that's what it takes. You deserve that peace, Aya. You deserve to know." She leaned into him, her face pressed against his chest, and he felt the shudder of her breath, the quiet acceptance of his promise. For a long time they sat together, the warmth of the fire casting shadows around them, their hearts bound by a shared commitment to each other's dreams, each other's healing. Their journey began with the winter thaw, as the snow melted away to reveal the budding life beneath, the promise of spring woven into the landscape around them. They packed only what they needed, leaving behind the trappings of isolation in favor of a future filled with exploration, adventure, and above all, love. They traveled from world to world, their path winding through unfamiliar places, each stop a new chapter in their story. Gideon marveled at the way Aya's eyes would light up with wonder each time they arrived somewhere new, her spirit blooming in ways that filled him with pride. She was no longer the girl he had found in chains. She was a woman of strength and resilience, a woman who faced the world with courage and joy. One night, as they lay beneath a sky filled with unfamiliar stars, Aya turned to him, her gaze filled with warmth and affection. "You know, I never imagined a life like this," she whispered, her voice soft. "A life where I could be free, where I could love and be loved." She reached out, her fingers tracing his face in a gentle, intimate gesture. "You've given me that, Gideon. You've given me more than I ever thought I could have." Gideon took her hand in his, pressing a kiss to her palm, his gaze filled with a quiet reverence. "You've given me life, Aya," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You've filled the empty spaces in my heart. And you've given me a reason to believe that, even after everything, love was meant for me too." They shared a soft, lingering kiss beneath the stars, a promise of forever in the gentle press of their lips, a vow that no matter where they went, they would face it together. Over time, Aya and Gideon continued to search for any trace of her family, following rumors and leads, each step bringing them closer to a truth that she had yearned for. And though the journey was fraught with uncertainty, with moments of doubt, they held each other through it all, their bond growing stronger with each shared experience, each new memory they made together. In the end, they found not only a piece of Aya's past but also a future that was bright and boundless, a future they chose together, where love was not just a fleeting feeling but a commitment, a foundation upon which they could build a life that was both beautiful and enduring. Years later, they would look back on this journey with gratitude, with pride, knowing that they had forged a path through the darkness, that they had built something lasting and true. And as they grew older together, their hearts intertwined, they knew that they had found in each other a love that defied age, a love that had healed their wounds, a love that had given them both the home they had always been searching for.